Polish cavalry charged German tanks myth. One of the most famous myths of World War II is that Polish soldiers on horses charged German tanks. You've probably seen the image. Heroic cavalrymen galloping toward tanks, sabers raised, ready to die for glory. It's cinematic, sure, but it's completely wrong. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, the Polish army still used cavalry, but not in the medieval way. These weren't knights with shiny armor, they were mounted infantry. The horses were their version of pickup trucks. They'd ride in fast, dismount, and fight with rifles, grenades, and anti-tank rifles, which could actually pierce early German armor. So yeah, not exactly sword versus tank. The myth came from the Battle of Krojanty. On the first day of the invasion, the 18th Pomeranian Ulan Regiment, led by Colonel Kazimierz Mastalers, spotted German infantry resting in a clearing near Chojnish. Just imagine a bunch of typical Germans sitting in the woods and drinking beer. He ordered a cavalry charge and it worked. The Germans panicked and scattered. It was an old-school ambush. Then, because life's unfair, German armored cars rolled in and opened fire. Dozens of horses and men were killed. The next day, Nazi propaganda journalists arrived, saw dead horses, sabers, and smoking wreckage, and decided to embarrass Poland as much as possible. Headlines basically read, "Brave but stupid Poles charge tanks." It was the 1939 version of a fake viral tweet, except it stuck for 80 years. In reality, Poland's army wasn't medieval, it was just massively outnumbered. They had 400 aircraft, 900 armored vehicles, and over 1 million troops. But the Blitzkrieg was fast, unstoppable, and everywhere at once. Hitler was a failed artist turned madman myth. Before he became the face of pure evil, Adolf Hitler was just a frustrated guy inspired with art trying to get into art school. Seriously, this man wanted to paint rooftops and bridges, not rule Europe. In 1907, he applied to the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna, and in 1908 applied again. Both times he was rejected. One of the examiners, Christian Griepenkerl, noted of his work, "Sample drawing is unsatisfactory, too few heads." The school suggested his talent lay in architecture, rather than painting human figures. So yeah, he basically didn't like certain people from the start, if you know what I mean. After the second rejection in 1908, Hitler, now about 19, drifted into an unsafe life in Vienna. He lived for a time in homeless shelters and at dormitories. He was making money by selling watercolors and postcards of Vienna's architecture to tourists. While others might have pivoted, Hitler absorbed the city's rampant nationalism, anti-Semitism, and conspiracy theories about German decline. By his own admission in Mein Kampf, those Vienna years shook him to his core. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Hitler enlisted in the Bavarian army. He saw action, was wounded, and returned to a Germany devastated by defeat and economic collapse. He was furious, and 25 years later, as an artist, he just decided to redraw the map of Europe. The failed artist-turned-madman myth is interesting, but it misses the point. You know, not every rejected artist starts a war. The swastika wasn't a Nazi invention. Today, when you see that black hooked cross on a white circle and red background, you think of a big and scary Nazi army. At least I do. But long before Hitler ever imagined his first version in a notebook, the swastika was a symbol of good fortune. Researchers have traced it to ancient India, Greece, China, and numerous Native American cultures. The word comes from Sanskrit language, and it means well-being. You could find it carved in Buddhist temples, deposited in Roman mosaics, and even at Christian churches well before Hitler was on the scene. In the late 1800s, European archaeologists like Heinrich Schliemann, the guy who excavated Troy, uncovered swastika-like motifs and used them to push theories of Aryan ancestry. By 1919, Hitler had joined the German Workers' Party and soon renamed it National Socialist German Workers' Party in February 1920. In 1920, he also doodled a bit and made the swastika on a red flag with a white circle, which was adopted by his party. Hitler also described its coloring in Mein Kampf. Red was for the social idea, white for the national thought, and the swastika for the struggle of the Aryan man. He basically stripped any good meaning off an ancient swastika and paired it with his own. And also, if you didn't know, even today, Hindu temples and Asian museums must have signs with the text, "Not Nazi related." The D-Day wasn't only an American effort myth. If you've watched Saving Private Ryan, you'd think D-Day was basically an all-American mission. Tom Hanks, a beach, and a large amount of bullets. But the truth is, D-Day was more like the Avengers Endgame of World War II. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, wasn't just an American operation. It involved 156,000 troops from multiple Allied nations: Americans, British, Canadians, Australians, Poles, Norwegians, and even a few Free French fighters. Each country had its own landing sector. The US took Omaha and Utah Beach, the British stormed Golden Sword, and the Canadians went for Juneau. It was teamwork on a scale humanity hadn't seen before and probably hasn't since. The British alone brought in around 62,000 troops, supported by over 4,000 ships and landing craft and more than 5,000 aircraft covering the skies that day. Their Royal Air Force flew over 5,500 sorties in the first 24 hours, which is actually more than one every 15 seconds. And it worked. Without that air dominance, the landing zones would have turned into a slaughter. Of course, Hollywood focused on the American side because that's where the most dramatic chaos took place. Omaha was a nightmare. But without British air superiority, Canadian infantry pushing inland, and massive deception operations by Allied intelligence, that invasion would have failed faster than Hitler's mustache-trend comeback attempt. So actually, D-Day's success didn't belong to one flag. It was the combined effort of a dozen nations who decided Nazism wasn't getting a sequel. If you're still here, thanks. It means a lot to me. Also hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on new videos. The German army was well supplied and machinized myth. Pop culture loves to show the Wehrmacht as these unstoppable, perfectly synchronized troops marching in formation, endless tanks rolling forward and aircraft flying overhead like it's a Michael Bay movie. But in reality, the German army was more like a bad startup. Great branding, impressive presentation, but broke behind the scenes. Sure, they had some genuinely terrifying machines, the Panzer IV, the Tiger I, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, all the best in their area at the time. The problem was they simply didn't have enough of them. By 1941, only about 20% of the German army was actually mechanized. The rest moved supplies and artillery with horses. Yeah, horses. I also didn't believe that when I heard it. There were around 2.7 million of them throughout the war. The so-called modern army was basically powered by horsepower in the literal sense. When people imagine blitzkrieg, they think of fast tanks, not soldiers digging through mud while feeding oats to their transport. Fuel shortages made things even worse. Germany had no major oil reserves, and part of the reason for invading the Soviet Union in 1941 was to reach the Caucasus oil fields. That plan fell apart when the Red Army stopped them cold at Stalingrad. By 1944, Allied bombers had crippled German oil production by over 80%, and soldiers were siphoning fuel from wrecked vehicles to keep moving. Tanks were being abandoned simply because they ran out of gas. On paper, the Wehrmacht looked like a Porsche GT3, but in practice, it handled more like a 1980s Yugo with two flat tires. Propaganda made them look invincible, but behind the front lines they were rationing tires, boots, and bullets. Hitler wanted to conquer the entire world myth. A lot of people think Hitler planned to take over the entire world, like some cartoon villain spinning a globe and laughing maniacally in his bunker.
That's how you do an evil laugh.
But in truth, his ambitions were far more regional than global. Hitler didn't want the world, he wanted Lebensraum, or living space, which basically meant pushing Germany's borders eastward into Europe and Russia to create a vast empire for the so-called Aryan race. Everyone else, well, they weren't invited to live in it. The concept came from a toxic cocktail of nationalism, pseudoscience, and good old-fashioned imperial envy. He looked at the British Empire's colonies and thought, why not us? This idea evolved into General Plan Ost, the Nazis' horrifying blueprint to depopulate Eastern Europe. The plan outlined mass deportations, forced labor and extermination of up to 50 million people to make way for German settlers, and they actually started doing it. By 1941, entire regions of Poland and Ukraine were already being emptied through murder, starvation, and deportation. Hitler's vision ended in Eurasia. He didn't dream of conquering Africa, the Americas, or the Pacific. He just wanted to dominate Europe. The problem was, his army couldn't even hold what it took. By late 1942, supply lines were falling apart, oil reserves were almost gone, and troops were freezing or starving on the Eastern Front. The world conqueror couldn't even conquer a Russian winter, let alone the planet. In fact, he was a big fan of Napoleon and even said that Napoleon didn't know when to stop while invading Russia. However, Hitler did exactly the same mistake. Atomic bomb was dropped to save lives myth. I think a lot of us already heard about the myth that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed to avoid a bloody invasion of Japan that could have cost millions of lives. But the truth is a lot more complicated. By mid-1945, Japan was already on the brink of collapse. Its navy was shattered, cities were in ruins, and US firebombing raids had already killed more people than the atomic bomb would in Hiroshima. The Japanese leadership knew they couldn't win, but surrender wasn't simple. They wanted assurances that Emperor Hirohito could stay in power. power, which is something Washington refused until after the bombs were dropped. Meanwhile, the US had already poured $2 billion into the Manhattan Project. Truman wasn't just deciding how to end the war, he was deciding how to justify the most expensive weapon in human history. And with the Soviet Union about to invade Japan from the north, the bomb also served a second purpose, sending a not-so-subtle message to Stalin about who ran the post-war world. When Little Boy hit Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, it instantly killed an estimated 70,000 people. 3 days later, Fat Man hit Nagasaki, killing about 40,000 more. Thousands more died in the following months from burns and radiation sickness. Yeah, I mean, it's possible the bombs accelerated Japan's surrender, but also the USA wanted to warn the Russians. French gave up without a fight myth. If you've spent any time online, you've probably heard the joke that the French just gave up during World War II, like they saw the Germans coming and immediately waved a white flag. But this is totally wrong. When Germany invaded on May 10, 1940, the French army was one of the largest and most experienced in Europe. They had about 2.2 million soldiers mobilized, backed by British forces. The Maginot Line, their heavily fortified defense system, was supposed to stop any invasion from the east. The problem? The Germans didn't attack where expected. Instead, they blitzed through the Ardennes forest, terrain French generals thought was impassable. Spoiler, it wasn't. In just 6 weeks, France was overwhelmed, but not because they didn't fight. The Battle of France claimed over 90,000 French soldiers' lives and left another 200,000 wounded. Even after occupation, the French didn't stop resisting. The Free French forces, led by Charles de Gaulle, kept fighting from abroad, while underground resistance groups sabotaged rail lines, assassinated German officers, and smuggled intelligence to the Allies. They played a key role in D-Day, disrupting supply routes before the Normandy landings. The French gave up myth mostly comes from German propaganda and decades of lazy jokes. Sure, the government surrendered, but many soldiers and civilians didn't. Hitler decided to let the British go at Dunkirk myth. This isn't entirely true, and it definitely wasn't because of mercy. By late May 1940, the German blitzkrieg had ripped through France and cornered the British Expeditionary Force, about 338,000 Allied troops on the beaches of Dunkirk. They were surrounded, low on ammo and waiting for rescue. Then, on May 24th, Hitler ordered his tanks to halt just as they were closing in. That single pause gave the Allies 3 crucial days to organize the evacuation known as Operation Dynamo, the Miracle of Dunkirk. But Hitler didn't do it out of kindness. He did it because his generals and the Luftwaffe convinced him the job was already done. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt warned that the ground around Dunkirk was too soft for tanks, and that German armor needed rest and refueling after weeks of non-stop fighting. Meanwhile, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, promised he could finish off the trapped troops from the air. Spoiler, he couldn't. British Spitfires and terrible weather ruined his plan. By the time the Panzers got rolling again, nearly 340,000 soldiers had been evacuated from the beaches by a fleet of 800 civilian and naval vessels, including fishing boats and ferries. Hitler later spun the halt order as a gesture of goodwill, claiming he hoped Britain would make peace. But historians agree it was one of his biggest strategic blunders. If he'd pushed harder, Britain might have lost most of its army. Instead, he gave Churchill the miracle he needed to rally the nation. Soviet endless waves of unarmed soldiers myth. While many of us have seen it in games like Call of Duty, maybe it's time to consider it is not so true. The Red Army wasn't just some mob with rifles. By 1943, it had become one of the most organized, mechanized, and strategically sophisticated forces in the world. Early in the war, yes, the Soviets suffered catastrophic losses. During Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the German invasion caught them off guard. Millions were killed or captured. There were moments when units were so desperate they lacked proper weapons, and Soviet propaganda films sometimes exaggerated heroic bayonet charges. That's where the human wave myth started. But by 1942, things had changed drastically. The USSR had industrially transformed itself, relocating 1,500 factories east of the Urals, out of German bombing range, and producing over 100,000 tanks and aircrafts during the war. When the Battle of Stalingrad began, Soviet tactics had evolved into efficiency. Coordinated artillery barrages, encirclement strategies, and urban warfare expertise turned the tide. In fact, the Red Army often had more heavy artillery per kilometer of front than the Germans did. The famous not one step back order, while harsh, was about discipline, not suicide missions. And the claim that one man got a rifle, the other got bullets, That line comes from the 2001 movie Enemy at the Gates, a Hollywood exaggeration from the earliest, most desperate months of the war. By 1943, every Soviet rifle division was fully equipped, supported by tanks, air power, and logistics rivaling any Western army. So no, the Soviets didn't win through sheer numbers or blind sacrifice. That's it for today. If you stayed until now, you are a true World War II fan. Also hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any new World War II content. Thanks for watching.